Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 570. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor, and we have a huge week coming up on the show here. I got a couple of guests lined up. Me and Connor will be writing and doing a lot of work at the Libertarian Institute as always. I'm going to be on Judging Freedom, Judge Napolitano show, Monday at 2 Eastern. So if you can, tune in and check that out. And of course, if I do a good job, let them know that you like me. That way they keep having me back on. Connor, people can find this show at the Libertarian Institute, where, of course, me and you both work and write news stories, at antiwar.com on the blog. You can find it at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you want to watch the video show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and follow it on Twitter at con_interest. All right, Connor, let's get into the news today. First story up here. Some pretty bold and interesting comments from our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Blinken says Israel becoming indistinguishable from Hamas. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken issued a stark warning to Tel Aviv that Israel risks becoming no different from a Hamas if it did not curb civilian casualties in Gaza. The senior official also said that the White House welcomed the opening of another border crossing into the territory, but would not be satisfied until more aid reached the Palestinians. During a press conference in Brussels on Thursday, Blinken pinned blame on Hamas for the severe deprivation in Gaza, but said that Tel Aviv shares some of the responsibility and must assist the millions of refugees displaced by the bombing spree. So this is a quote from Blinken. What happened after October 7th could have ended immediately if Hamas had stopped hiding behind civilians, released the hostages, and put down its weapons. But Israel is not Hamas. Israel is a democracy. Hamas is a terrorist organization. And democracies place the highest value on human life, every human life. It is what distinguishes us from terrorists like Hamas. If we lose that reverence for human life, we risk becoming indistinguishable from those we confront. And so, Connor, I think there's a couple pretty misleading, statements in all of this. And one, this idea that the Israeli, not the Israeli, I guess, people, but certainly their government value all human life equally is just something that is obviously not true. And if it wasn't already obvious before, the fact that Israel has this Lavender AI software that gives every single Palestinian a score. And again, I described this this way when I appeared on Robbie Bernstein's show, Run Your Mouth. This is basically the American nightmare of the social credit score, right? It is the plot to Captain America Civil War, this idea that Israel essentially has a gun pointed at the head of every single citizen in Palestine. And if this program decides that, they're too close to Hamas, that they must be a member of Hamas, and it flips you from, 59 to 60 on the scale or whatever, number they set it at, then not only will they kill you, they will kill your entire family. It's not that they're just going to target you right away and take you out with a bullet. They're going to wait until you go home, and they're going to bomb you. So, this is far worse than what happened on October 7th, what was described here. And, the members of the Palestinians who live in Gaza, these family members and all these people have experienced several October 7th several times over since. And so this idea, again, that Israel values human life, that, they could become terrorists like Hamas, they're already there. This is already happening. And in fact, if you look at things such as how the Hamas hostages have been kept versus how the Palestinians rounded up by Israel have been kept, there seems to be a pretty stark difference. I'm take a quick detour here, Connor, and just go to this letter that was published by a doctor. And an Israeli doctor says detention of Palestinians violates international laws. And this was reported by Haaretz, Israeli media. And it says a doctor at a field hospital set up at one of the prison's camps said, just this week, 2 prisoners had their legs amputated due to handcuff injuries, which unfortunately is a routine event. From the first days of the medical facility's operation until today, I have faced serious ethical dilemmas. More than that, I am writing this letter to warn you that the facility's operations do not comply with a single section among those dealing with health and incarceration of unlawful combatants law. No patient who was referred to a hospital has remained there for more than a few hours. It happens that the patients have major operations such as abdominal surgeries for intestinal restrictions are brought back after about an hour of post-op observation during recovery to the prison's medical facility, which is staffed with most of the day by a single doctor accompanied by a nursing team, some with no medic training. This ends in complications and sometimes even the patient's death. This makes all of us, the medical teams, you, those in charge of us, and the health and defense ministries, complicit in the violation of Israeli law, and perhaps worse for me as a doctor, in violation of my basic commitments to the patients wherever they are, as I swore when I graduated 20 years ago. So that, is an extremely dark letter, Connor. And just to add a few more details from that letter that he pointed out, the Palestinians that are held captive are not only kept handcuffed 24 hours a day, which explains, especially if they're using plastic handcuffs, which it was apparently widely used, at least in the first portion of the war, and they're too tight. It basically, cuts the skin, and then it gets infected because they're not providing antibiotics and medical care. And, the infection spreads, and that's what's leading to the amputations. They're also kept, I guess, seated, blindfolded all day. They're only fed through a straw, and they're also forced to wear diapers. They're not allowed to go to the bathroom, so they constantly defecate on themselves, which I'm sure adds to the infection and everything like that. So, this is, again, absolutely horrific. And when you consider what we say, that we have to support Israel here because of what Hamas did on October 7th. Well, why not support the Palestinians because of what the Israelis have done to them since? So Blinken's statement came amid Israel's 6-month brutal onslaught in Gaza, which has earned Tel Aviv much negative press in recent days, given the scale and destruction of the human carnage. On Monday in central Gaza, Israel killed a 7-member aid team working for a U.S. NGO, World Central Kitchen, with 3 strikes. The aid workers were from Western countries, including the U.S., provoking demands that Tel Aviv investigate the crime. Additionally, Haaretz reported that Israeli forces have established unmarked kill zones in Gaza that have resulted in the death of countless innocent Palestinians. And something to point out in these kill zones, Connor, when Israel says, well, we've killed 9,000 Hamas fighters, anybody who enters one of these kill zones is just murdered and counted as a terrorist. And as we have seen countless videos of it, to me, I don't know why this crime just stands out so much to me, Connor, but desecrating over and over again the bodies of the Palestinians. And so, a lot of these bodies have just been drugged by heavy machinery, I'm sure dismembered and disfigured and just put under a small pile of rubble where it will likely decompose until nobody could identify the body. And so there's probably so many people who are being killed, young people, children, little girls, little boys, women, elderly people who are just being gunned down, crossing these invisible barriers. And it's so much darker to think about too, Connor, when you consider that the U.S. is essentially conducting these indiscriminate aid drops in northern Gaza, right? You can't control exactly where a parachute is going to land. Wind blows, and not only have these ended up in the sea and people have drowned trying to recover the aid drops, but if you drop some aid and somebody sees it fall, Connor, and their house is on the opposite side of one of these kill zones, and Israel doesn't mark the kill zones, they don't inform the Palestinians of the kill zones, the aid essentially becomes a cheese in the IDF trap for the Palestinians, where they leave their homes, they go out to get some food, they cross one of these unmarked lines, and they have their lives taken from them. And there have been several videos that have come out over the past, I would say particularly 2 weeks, showing Israeli forces gunning down Palestinians who are attempting to get aid. And I mean, for the Palestinians, and maybe I guess this is my hope as an American, that my government isn't sitting here thinking that, this is some kind of sadistic cruelty where we're going to drop these aid packages and some of them are going to end up in kill zones and the Palestinians will get gunned down for it. But that is effectively what's happening on the ground, that we're participating in this slaughter of civilians, just seeking to feed their families and themselves as they slowly starve to death. is really just, the most cruel and dystopian thing you could think of. So, in response to the murder of the American aid worker, President Joe Biden called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and demanded that Israel protect civil life and allow more aid into Gaza. On Friday, Israel announced it had dismissed 2 officers who had approved the strikes on the aid convoy, and then said that there were 3 others that received a reprimand. We'll get into that a little bit more. Blinken said that Washington welcomed the step, particularly the opening of the aid crossing. However, the White House said it wanted to see results. Aid shipments in Gaza have plummeted since October 7th, when Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced that Tel Aviv would effectively bar all humanitarian assistance from entering the territory. Before October, more than 500 aid trucks entered, and other commercial vehicles as well were able to enter Gaza each day. In February, that number sunk to below 100 trucks per day. According to Tel Aviv, that number has ticked up some, but is only about 150 trucks per day. And Connor, we know that I do believe that those 150 trucks do count the American aid that's being airdropped into Gaza. I think, they're just counting the trucks worth of aid that they approve, and some of that aid is then airdropped into Gaza. You also have that some of this aid is able to get in, it's able to get into Rafah, but not really being able to distribute where it needs. And so what the U.S. is saying, that while opening another aid crossing may be nice, that's really not the issue here, that there's not enough aid crossings open, is that the aid just can't be distributed in Gaza, and Israel isn't approving enough aid to get into the Strip. So in addition to increasing the number of trucks entering Gaza, aid groups say that only a ceasefire will allow aid to reach the most devastated areas of the Strip, where thousands remain on the brink of famine. All right, so now let's get into this one. Aid groups say, our aid group hit by IDF strike says Israeli response is cold comfort. So Israel said its probe into the killing of 7 members of the World Central Kitchen's Gaza aid team found that serious mistakes were made and punished 5 of its soldiers. WCK said the move meant little after the death and called upon Israel to respect all civilian life. On Monday, Israel conducted a series of 3 strikes on a convoy of WCK cars, wiping out the group's Gaza aid team. And that's, I think, something really important to note here, Connor. It's not like there were maybe 20, 30 members of this organization traveling together and, some of them were killed in airstrikes. This was the entire team that was wiped out here. So several members of the WCK staff were from Western countries, including the U.S., which led to a rare White House condemnation of Tel Aviv. And of course, we went through this on Friday's show, so I don't want to go over the details again and again and again on this, but it is important to note here, Connor, that this wasn't the case where Israel dropped 1 or 3 bombs at these 3 cars at the same time, and there was just a mistake made or something like that they hit the first car, the wounded were loaded into the second car, which was bombed a half mile down the road, who were loaded into another car, which was then bombed again. All these cars were marked, of course. Nobody was armed. There's nothing in any possible way to justify or excuse this, and yet it happened, and the U.S. is going to keep sending Israel weapons. So on Friday, Israeli officials announced the preliminary results of the investigation into the attack. It said it was a serious event that we are responsible for, and it shouldn't have happened, and we will make sure that it won't happen again. But this has happened time and time again. These are the first, I guess, 7 Western aid workers to die in Gaza, Connor, but they are 7 of over 200 aid workers who have been killed in total. And so, it's kind of disgusting that we only care this time because one of the guys happens to be from the U.S. The IDF dismissed 2 officers and reprimanded 3 others in response. So, you can murder international aid workers, Connor, you're just going to lose your job. A couple months ago, I could have sworn Biden said that if Americans get killed anywhere, we're going to bomb people and then drop scores of bombs on Iraq and Syria. But doesn't seem like any plans to bomb Israel, unless you just mean we're going to send them pallets of bombs. So the CEO of the aid group, which was feeding some 500,000 Palestinians every day before these attacks, said the Israeli actions were the Israeli actions meant little to the victims. Their apologies for the outrageous killing of our colleagues represent cold comfort, said WCK Chief Executive Aaron Gore. It's cold comfort for the victims' families and the WCK's global family. Israel needs to take concrete steps to ensure the safety of humanitarian aid workers. Our operations remain suspended. The group's founder, that Chef Jose Andres, echoes Gore and added that Israel must protect all civilians, not only employees of his organization. It's not enough to simply try to avoid further humanitarian deaths, which have approached to close to 200, Andres explained. All civilians need to be protected, which all innocent people in Gaza need to be fed and safe, and hostages must be released. And it's not just the aid workers. It's hundreds of medical staff. It's over 100 journalists now, just, slaughter of obviously innocent civilians. They've killed the Gaza police force that was escorting and helping to ensure this aid was distributed around the Strip. So in a press release from the organization, WCK said that accepting blame was an important step for Israel, but insisted it must do more. The IDF has acknowledged its responsibility and its fatal errors in the deadly attack on our convoy in Gaza. These are important steps forward. However, it is also clear from their preliminary investigation that the IDF has deployed deadly force without regard to its own protocols, chain of command, and rules of engagement. The IDF's own video fails to show how any cause to fire on our personal convoy, which carried no weapons and posed no threat. Without systemic change, there will be more military failures, more apologies, and more grieving families. The root cause of the unjustified rocket fire on our convoy is the severe lack of food in Gaza. Israel needs to dramatically increase the volume of food and medicine traveling by land if it is serious about supporting humanitarian aid. So that was all from the WCK statement. The killing of international aid workers has triggered an outpouring of criticism of Tel Aviv, even from Washington, which has typically refused to issue even mild condemnations of very clear and obvious Israeli war crimes. However, the White House continues to send billions of dollars in weapons without any conditions. While the latest scandal marks one of the first times the Joe Biden administration has condemned any Israeli action over the past 6 months, it is not the IDF's first attack on aid workers. Overall, at least 200 aid workers have lost their lives in both Gaza and the occupied West Bank since last October. Overall, at least 33,000 Gazans have been killed, 70% of whom are women and children. Along the lines of media reports indicate that targeting women and children is intentional. And, I just mentioned there again, the Lavender program. Now, Connor, there have been some updates today. This is Sunday, April 7th right now, where Israel says they have pared down to 1 brigade in southern Gaza. And, I guess this would suggest there's not a major plan to launch operations in Rafah at the minute here. But, I don't think that this is an indication that the White House demanded Israel put in a ceasefire, and that has been put into place. All right, so I just have one more quick thing to mention here. Israel lobby targets former GOP rep John Hostler's campaign. So this is a former congressman from Indiana. He served 2 decades ago, and AIPAC are the Republican Jewish Coalition and the United Democracy Project, 2 super PACs tied to AIPAC, announced they were launching a series of ads, $500,000 worth, against the former congressman because they said that he has a terrible record on Israel, and what they point to was one vote, I believe in 2003, when Israel was bombing Gaza, that he did not vote in support of Israel. So Israel, the AIPAC has so much control, the Israel lobby has so much control over American politics that, in the wake of Israel killing even an American aid worker in Gaza, you have people like Senator John Fetterman. And I don't know, Connor, maybe there's some correlation here between people who seem to have degenerative brain issues and support for Israel. But he has been one of the most vocal Zionists since October 7th. And no matter what Israel does, everything is right as long as they're killing Palestinians, I suppose. All right, Connor, let me hand it over to you. I know you got some news on the Middle East, but you got this good article out for us at the Libertarian Institute. As Ukraine's war effort fails, Kiev embraces neo-Nazi bad guys attacking Russia, that you published at the Libertarian Institute on the 5th.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is there's nothing too revelatory in this article, but there's a lot of good quotes and just more confirmation that the U.S. via its Ukraine proxy in this war with Russia is consorting with and supporting these neo-Nazi militias that are running over the border into the mainland of Russia, attacking civilian areas, towns, and villages. We've seen waves of attacks from these groups, and it's led by a very prominent neo-Nazi activist named Denis Kapustin. And we've previously seen him reported on by his other, I guess, he's also known as Denis Nikitin. But this is some interesting stuff about the relationship that this neo-Nazi group has, not only with Ukrainian military intelligence, but with these other militias that are also conducting similar attacks in Russia. So this was from Politico. So I write, as a result of fighting Moscow as a NATO proxy for more than 2 years, Ukraine's armed forces have depleted their manpower, air defenses, arms, and ammunition. And since the catastrophic failure of Kiev's summer counteroffensive last year, the war effort is focused more on artillery and drone attacks, as well as raids by neo-Nazi militias against the Russian mainland. So in a recent interview with Politico, Denis Kapustin, also known as Denis Nikitin, describes his Russian Volunteer Corps' role in Ukraine's war with Russia. So the Russian Volunteer Corps is armed with NATO weaponry as well as U.S. armored vehicles. The group maintains ties with Ukrainian military intelligence and has repeatedly launched cross-border raids into civilian areas of Russia, notably the Belgorod region and Kursk, attacking villages and towns. And the group is said to be made up of Russian citizens, including some members of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, who fought since 2014 for Kiev during the Donbass War. So while Berlin has named Kapustin, quote, one of the most influential neo-Nazi activists in all of Europe, Kapustin told Politico, "We're the bad guys, but fighting really evil guys." So besides the Russian Volunteer Corps, there are other Ukraine-backed paramilitary groups with origins in Russia leading these cross-border raids, including the so-called Freedom of Russia Legion and the more recently established Siberian Battalion. All three participated in an attack last month against Belgorod and Kursk. And the Russian Defense Ministry announced, quote, all attempts by Ukrainian forces to cross into the territory of the Belgorod and Kursk regions from March 12 through 15 were repelled. Airstrikes and artillery fire destroyed more than 550 troops, 16 tanks, 19 armored vehicles, including 11 U.S.-made Bradley vehicles, and 15 motor vehicles. This is a very significant attack. And Alexei Baranovsky of the Freedom of Russia Legion claimed their terrorist attack had disrupted the plans of the Russian army and caused significant damage to it. Now, according to Russian authorities, more than 2,000 fighters were involved in these raids last month. A press conference was held in Kiev with leaders of the three groups shortly after the operation took place. There was still some fighting ongoing, but this is from a Reuters report where they were interviewing these guys in Kiev at a press conference, and the report said the militias say they received intelligence and logistics support from Ukrainian armed forces, but repeated their assertion that they were acting independently of Kiev when fighting on Russian territory. Kapustin said Ukraine provided ammunition and medical evacuation for his fighters. The Freedom of Russia Legion, this is Baranovsky speaking to Politico during the press conference. He says that his Freedom of Russia Legion is a regular unit of the armed forces of Ukraine. He says, when we're on the territory of Ukraine, we are servicemen of the Ukrainian army, equal in all rights and duties to all other servicemen of Ukraine. When we go to the territory of Russia, we are no longer Ukrainian servicemen. We are Russian citizens who have taken up arms. So that's a very convenient way of sort of rationalizing and the dissolvement of responsibility here. So according to the outlet, the ties between her, that's Ukrainian military intelligence, and the Russian Volunteer Corps are not universally popular. An unnamed official sitting on Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council lamented, and for what? These militias are a sideshow. They can't influence the war's dynamics. Maybe they disrupt a bit behind the lines and are embarrassing for the Kremlin, but that doesn't outweigh the overall propaganda disadvantages of using them. And a big part of this article in Politico, which obviously I cut because it's so absurd, is that basically they're saying that, oh, this is kind of a bad thing because this is only going to help Russia's propaganda efforts in this the idea of denazifying Ukraine. When of course there's a myriad of neo-Nazi militias involved with the Ukrainian government. The formerly mentioned Azov Battalion is a part of the National Guard in Ukraine. And they were these neo-Nazi groups were the spearhead of the Donbass war for years and years before Russia ever invaded in February of 22. So I continue with the article. This view is contrasted, however, with the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Kirilo Budanov, who enthused that the militias are good warriors during the attack last month. He said, "They've been helping us since the first day. They have fought in many of Ukraine's hottest spots. We're going to try and help them as much as we can." Andrei Yusov, a spokesman for her, agreed, saying, quote, "Ukraine should obviously also assist those Russians who are fighting against Putin's regime to free Russia." Yusov claims the militias do not act on direct orders from Kiev when storming over the border into Russia during their raids. Kaputsin explains that the groups have freedom of action inside Russia. However, their attacks are closely coordinated with her, which assists with logistical support, financial backing, the vetting of operational plans, as well as the provision of arms. Now, these three paramilitary outfits are formally part of the armed forces of Ukraine. They're enlisted in the International Legion, Kapustin says. He adds, "We're an official part of the Ukrainian army, but we have serious political ambitions and a political agenda to march toward Moscow and dismantle the Putin regime. That is obviously in the interests of Ukraine." It is not clear how many fighters belong to any of these three militias, but Kapustin assures we are now definitely a sizable force, possessing our own arms and vehicles, possessing our own mortars, heavy machine guns, and artillery. Russian Volunteer Corps is not anymore a gang, it is a regiment. We have bases, we have our recruitment system. And so, as it becomes clearer and clearer that Ukraine has no chance of winning on the battlefield, they've lost 20% of their territory. There's been about 500,000 casualties of Ukrainian conscripts who have been killed or so severely wounded that they can't return to fighting. And of course, the Ukrainian military's failed in its effort against Russia. They've lost 20% of their territory, losing the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, as well as Luhansk and Donetsk. There's no way they're getting Crimea back, despite the hysterical rhetoric from Brussels or any of the hawks in Europe and Washington, who still hold on to that fantasy. What we're seeing is more and more preparations for attacks, for instance, on the Kerch Bridge. So more Russian infrastructure. The Kerch Bridge connects the Crimean Peninsula to the Russian mainland. And of course, these threats that NATO countries are going to start deploying their own troops, particularly the French are talking up plans about major deployments. And so they're just relying more on these attacks against really Russian civilians. And a big part of these attacks inside Russia, which don't serve any real critical battlefield advantage or tactical advantage, what they're really doing is, and this has been quoted by Ukrainian officials in, for instance, this report in The Economist that outlines the collaboration with U.S. and Western intelligence in these attacks on Russia. The idea is to bring it's supposed to have a psychological impact on the Russian population. And I don't know if that means that they think they're going to turn the public against Moscow. Maybe that's part of the goal. But in the meantime, it just serves to provoke further attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, their energy grid, etc., and really serves no benefit to the Ukrainian people or the war effort more broadly. And of course, this is a huge escalation that we are just openly allied with these neo-Nazi groups. I mean, when Kapustin brags about we have our own arms and vehicles, we have our mortars and heavy machine guns and artillery, they're getting that from the weapons that are being poured into the country by the United States primarily. And so this is extremely dangerous. And there's no real sign that these guys are going to let up. As far as what, I mean, there's no way that they can pull off a regime change in Russia, even though that's also a goal of many of the hawkish forces in Europe and in Washington, to break up Russia, to cause a regime change, to cripple their economy and their military. All of these goals have completely fallen through, and even we have admissions from the number 2 man at the State Department, Kirk Campbell. And Kyle just wrote this piece recently where they're acknowledging that Russia, any kind of damage we've done to the Russian military thus far has been reconciled. They've reconstituted their military forces. We have the admission from the head of the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO that Russia's ground forces are bigger today than they were when the war began. The Air Force and the Navy have only taken negligible losses, and they've of course outpaced the artillery and ammunition production of the entire NATO alliance by at least 3 times, and that's by NATO's own numbers. So the war is going horribly, and yet we're seeing more of a reliance on these radical forces, these actual Nazis. And of course, the optics are horrific, sending over Nazis armed with a NATO weaponry to go and kill Russian civilians in terrorist attacks. It's just extremely provocative, and will only result in further damage done to Ukraine, its people, and just, again, making a diplomatic settlement less likely. And so this is the kind of thing that the American people should be very resentful of. And we should have, if we had a real legislative branch and people representing the American people in Congress, this wouldn't be allowed to continue. Okay, so this next story, moving back to the Middle East. Jason Ditz has some coverage on what's been going on between Israel and Lebanon, the continuing. Well, the war could really expand here soon, but we have more and more fighting across the border, more and more strikes from Israel. So 8 killed as Israel strikes across southern Lebanon. This is from Jason on the 6th of April. So strikes by Israeli forces continued to escalate on Friday into Saturday, with towns in southern Lebanon experiencing heavy shelling and airstrikes targeting homes and buildings across the area. 8 were estimated to have been killed in these strikes. 3 members of the Amal movement were killed on Friday night in an attack on their building in Mara Jejun. A 4th member was reported wounded in the strike. The Amal movement is the largest Shiite political party in Lebanon, and they're aligned with Hezbollah. Strikes elsewhere in the south, including in Ayat al-Shab and Carnage, killed at least 5 Hezbollah members and wounded 10 others, mainly civilians. 1 member of the Lebanon military was among the wounded in Kafr Hammam. Hezbollah was retaliating as well, hitting Warda, Bilda, the Zaret barracks, and among other sites throughout northern Israel. Damage and injuries from these strikes has not been reported as of yet. Now, the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, used his Quds Day speech to proclaim that the movement intends to retaliate further, not only for the Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon, but also for the recent Israeli bombing of the Iranian consulate in Syria. Now, Iran remains on alert for the possibility of retaliation over the bombing of the Iran diplomatic facilities, closing dozens of its embassies, tying up security. Iran has also threatened its own retaliation in its time of choosing. And the international community has tried to broker a ceasefire to prevent an Israeli offensive into Lebanon. This isn't making much progress. The Defense Ministry of Israel is instead focused on preparing the public for a full-scale war. And that's coming direct from the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, who is also threatening that, any war with Hezbollah and Israel is going to devastate Lebanon. And they really are trying to prepare the Israeli public for not only an expanded war with Hezbollah, which will be an absolute disaster, but also war with Iran. And so, of course, if Israel gets into heavy fighting with Hezbollah, it would probably involve at least some sort of U.S. support. I would imagine, I don't know exactly in what capacity, but you could see, further deploy. We could see the aircraft carrier strike groups deployed again, or troops on the ground supporting the Israelis. It could get very out of control very fast if a war with with Iran breaks out, which is more likely if a direct war with Hezbollah really kicks into high gear. We could see the entire region blow up, really. I mean, it would be the entire axis of resistance versus the Americans and the Israelis. And so this is very dangerous. We know there's that DIA assessment that came out in the Washington Post a couple of months ago that suggests that Israel is just not capable of taking on Hezbollah by itself. And this war is very critical to the Israeli war cabinet, particularly Netanyahu, with all of his political liabilities right now. The fact that he's, before the war started, before October 7th, he was facing all these corruption trials and huge protests in the streets over his efforts to cripple the power of the judiciary in Israel. And now they've got a lot of blood on their hands as a result of the major security lapses that allowed the attack on October 7th to happen. And of course, his efforts to sabotage any sort of negotiations to get the Israeli hostages, home. And so, in order to basically cover his right flank here, he's going to have to expand the war and protect himself from his own people and stay in power as long as possible. And so, a war with Iran would certainly accomplish all those goals and help to distract from the genocidal campaign in Gaza. And so a truce in Lebanon would have to involve a ceasefire in Gaza, but this is also being worked on by the international community, but so far to no avail. What does seem to be trending is a further escalation of the conflict, Jason says. And so in this next story, as strikes escalate, 100,000 estimated to have fled from southern Lebanon. So this is from Jason again on April 4th. Near daily strikes in southern Lebanon have sent a large portion of the population fleeing deeper into the country. Just a few weeks ago, 90,000 residents were estimated as being displaced. Reports are now that 100,000 people of the region's 150,000 have fled. And since the strikes started in October, some 313 have been killed and more than 1,000 people have been wounded. But the longer-term impact, however, may be the economic damage to the region's farming. Attacks have destroyed some 8 million square meters of farmland. Between this and population displacement, nearly 75% of the residents in the area have lost their ability to earn a living by farming. Prime Minister Najib Mikati says the government must declare the south of the country to be an agricultural disaster zone. While the government has promised to compensate those whose homes were damaged in the strikes, there is no number as to how many homes will be included. Early estimates put it in the thousands. This large number is a clear result of Israel striking, quote, Hezbollah buildings that almost invariably turn out to be houses in small villages. Locals from the area hope to return as soon as the ceasefire is reached with Israel. The same hope is true for northern Israel, where 60,000 people have been displaced, but Israeli military officials have suggested returning northerners home requires a military offensive rather than a diplomatic settlement. Mikati says that allies throughout the world are working to halt Israeli aggression, adding Lebanon seeks real peace. Analysts have suggested that any truce in Lebanon must be connected to a ceasefire in Gaza, and considerable work by multiple countries is ongoing in that effort. Reportedly, a truce in Lebanon will involve Hezbollah being displaced further north and replaced by the Lebanese army. The French have been pushing this plan, and the U.S. has even offered to fund Lebanon to see to its implementation. And of course, the biggest part of this is the U.S. has to use its leverage with Israel to end the war in Gaza. That is the only, to lift the siege, allow aid unimpeded to enter the Strip, to allow the Strip to be rebuilt, and to help facilitate, or at least not get in the way, or not allow the Israelis to get in the way of these displaced Palestinians who are now in Rafah, about 1.5 or 1.7 million of them, to find a way to protect their families and return home, although most of their homes, particularly in North Gaza, have been destroyed. I mean, there's really, we're talking about more than, as far as recently as as far back as January, they were already, the analysis of satellite imagery and these studies are being done. We're already suggesting that more than 60% of all the homes and infrastructure have been destroyed. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of homes that have been destroyed in this genocidal onslaught. So there's really, it's very up in the air as to what these people have to return to, which is why it's critical that reconstruction materials be allowed back in. And this is one of the reasons. The Israelis have been just absolutely leaving the Gazans in a horrible situation after each of these bombing campaigns before the 7th, where you have, no building materials are allowed in. So you have for years and years Gazans who have been living in just rubble, really. I mean, especially after these major air campaigns like we saw in the 51-day war, Operation Protective Edge in 2014. And they were always bombing civilian infrastructure and universities and homes and factories and clinics. And, it's just on a much larger scale now since the 7th. And so there's going to be a lot of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. But of course, the Americans don't appear to be using any of their leverage with the Israelis, despite some rhetorical flourishes here and there, especially after the Israelis just in front of the whole world murdered an American aid worker from World Central Kitchen. We still see that we're sending them over, getting ready to approve an $18 billion deal for 50 F-15s. We're sending over thousands of MK-82 500 bombs, more than 1,800 MK-84 2,000-pound bombs, small diameter bombs. And of course, there's this nearly $3 billion deal for, I believe, 25 F-35 fighter jets as well. So there's just absolutely no there as far as, the Biden administration's ostensible frustration with the Israelis and how they're going to start making some changes that'll be reflected in the policy. That's what we hear, but we don't see any actual substantive changes. And so until then, of course, this war with Hezbollah is much more likely, especially, as I said earlier, as Netanyahu needs ways to stay in power and to maintain at least his ability to keep the country in a state of emergency, such as it is, but so that they can't call for elections. So that means expanding the war at a minimum. And so moving on to Yemen. We have this piece from Dave DeCamp on April 4th. U.S. and U.K. have bombed Yemen 148 times since January. So at least 148 missile strikes have hit Yemen since the U.S. and U.K. launched their new bombing campaign against the Houthis in January. And this is according to the Yemen Data Project. So the YDP said in the first 80 days of the U.S.-led bombing campaign that started on January 12th, a total of 339 munitions have hit Yemen, averaging more than 4 per day. This is the poorest country in the Middle East that we're bombing at least 4 times per day because they attempted to stand in the way of the West's support for this genocide against Muslims and Christians in Palestine. So the UK has joined the US in several rounds of these missile strikes, but most have been unilateral US attacks on Houthi-controlled Yemen. So the YDP says that there was a drop in strikes in March, with only 35 recorded compared with 79 in February. And the group said there were no reports of civilian casualties in March after 11 were recorded in February. The leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, said in March that a total of 34 Houthi fighters have been killed since the Yemeni group, officially known as Ansar Allah, began targeting Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea last year in response to the onslaught in Gaza. The U.S.-British bombing campaign has done nothing to deter the Red Sea attacks and has only escalated the situation because the Houthis have since been targeting American and British shipping in response, of course. And so in January, President Biden acknowledged the bombing wasn't working, but vowed to continue it anyway, like the rest of his policies, especially with regards to the Middle East. So the Houthis have been clear the only way they would stop targeting Israel-linked shipping is if the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza comes to an end. But the U.S. chose escalation instead of pressuring the Israelis to stop by leveraging military aid. So the U.S. has backed a brutal Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis from 2015 to 2022. This involved heavy airstrikes and a full blockade from the air, land, and sea. And the group only became more of a capable fighting force during all that fighting, during the war. And so the war killed at least 377,000 people. And that's a conservative estimate from the UN that came out toward the end of 2021. The vast majority of those people who were killed were infants and children less than 5 years old. The starvation and disease caused by the siege, as well as the leveling of virtually all civilian infrastructure that could sustain life. These kinds of campaigns, like we see in Gaza, the worst effect. Usually, the people that are most in danger by these kinds of wars are children and people who are elderly and diseased, but we see children bearing the brunt these kind of genocidal warfighting strategies that the U.S. and its satellites in the region are fond of, particularly the Saudis and the Israelis, of course. So a ceasefire between the Houthis and the Saudis has held relatively well since April of 2022. There hasn't been any cross-border strikes from either side, but new U.S. sanctions are blocking the implementation of a lasting peace deal, and which is really devastating because this is. I mean, the war in Yemen it's interesting because this was a Vietnam level atrocity. I mean, wouldn't be surprising to any of us if the excess death rate of the entire war on Yemen, the U.S. backed Saudi UAE war on Yemen, was more than 1 million people killed because they were, like I said, bombing the farms, the fishing boats, the hospitals, school buses, apartments, residential areas, every flocks of sheep and horses in stables, just bombing every single kind of marketplaces and anything for people that have any kind of a normal life to feed their families or to make a living was just bombed off the face of the earth with American intelligence, American bombs, American warplanes. And this went on for years and years and years. And hundreds of thousands of people were starving. Millions of people were on the brink of famine. And we saw a massive cholera epidemic that broke out. And of course, all these policies continued right through the entire COVID pandemic. There was never a rollback of the blockade or the bombing. And when Biden came into office, he said he was going to treat the Saudis like the pariah that they are and talked a real big game. But by the beginning of 2022, the end of 2021, Biden had already authorized more than $1 billion, I think closer to $2 billion, in weapons sales, new weapons sales for Saudi Arabia, and they were carrying out some of their worst bombing raids since for years since the war began. I think they were setting records for the largest attacks since 2016, and so this is the Biden administration always seems to be clinging to this idea that if they could just get Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with apartheid Israel, that would be such a foreign policy win for the administration. It would really look good heading into the election season. And so, as I said, this is a Vietnam level atrocity, this war on Yemen. So if Biden was able to admit he was wrong, and I don't know if he doesn't want to be culpable publicly, admit that he knows he's culpable for war crimes, but what he could do is say this was a mistake and help facilitate the peace deal by lifting those sanctions. And of course, he won't do that. That would be an actual foreign policy win. In order to do that, he would have to also likely, I don't know. I suppose they could do the deal with the Houthis and the Saudis without having to leverage all their aid with Israel and get them to stop the war in Gaza. It wouldn't stop the problem of the Houthis attacking Israeli-linked shipping and, of course, by extension, American and British shipping and the American Navy ships. But what they could do is, do both. Both things are imperative. So it's just, if they wanted to win in terms of foreign policy, they could help these poor people and get some food into Yemen and start at least ending their blockade on the country and their support for, these bombing campaigns against Yemen. Is just horrible. And of course, it can provoke further escalation. And so this next piece suggests that it's possible the Biden administration is waking up to the fact that this bombing campaign against the Houthis is a dead end. So this is from Dave DeCamp on April 4th. U.S. envoy suggests diplomacy with the Houthis as the bombing campaign has failed. So this is Tim Lenderking. This is Biden's envoy for Yemen. He says the U.S. wants a diplomatic solution with the Houthis as its bombing campaign has failed to deter the Yemeni group and has only escalated the situation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. He says, my hope is that we can find some diplomatic off-ramps. And this is from an interview on Wednesday. He suggested the U.S. could reverse its recent decision to redesignate the Houthis as, quote, specially designated global terrorists, which imposed new sanctions that are blocking a peace deal between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. Leonard King said the U.S. is looking for ways to de-escalate and allow us to pull back eventually the designation, and of course to end the military strikes on the Houthis' military capability. The Houthis have been clear that they would only stop their attacks on Israel-linked shipping if Israel ends its genocidal campaign in Gaza. Lender King has previously acknowledged that he believes the Houthis would be true to their word and would stop the Red Sea attacks if there was a ceasefire in Gaza. Since President Biden launched his new unauthorized war against the Houthis on January 12th, the U.S. and the U.K. have bombed Yemen at least 148 times, according again to that data from the Yemen, those numbers from the Yemen Data Project. And so, despite the failure of the campaign, Washington continues to launch strikes on Houthi-controlled Yemen. CENTCOM on Wednesday said that U.S. forces in the Red Sea intercepted a Houthi missile and 2 drones. It also claimed that CENTCOM forces destroyed a mobile surface-to-air system in Houthi-controlled territory. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have controlled Sana'a, Yemen's capital, since 2014 and govern an area of Yemen where 70 to 80% of Yemenis live. The U.S. backed a brutal Saudi-UAE war that failed to oust them, killing nearly 400,000 people. So, it's disheartening. It's on the one hand, it's good to hear them admit once again that their bombing campaign against the Houthis isn't accomplishing anything except killing some civilians and wasting a lot of money and regularly bombing a country, the poorest country in the Middle East, of where we've killed hundreds of thousands of people, mostly children. So this is, again, just dragging America's legacy and name through the mud, which seems to be the Biden administration's MO. It is disheartening to hear Lender King say, well, yeah, eventually we would lift the designation. We'd like to, and, see an end to the military strikes and the Houthis' military capability. So it doesn't sound like it's a major priority, of course. And that's really unfortunate because, as I said, they would be much better served by focusing on making peace in the region instead of trying to find out how they can have their genocide cake and eat it too, by basically, going to the Saudis and saying, well, when the Israelis are done with their domicide in Gaza, and it's completely uninhabitable, whatever remaining Palestinians we allow to live on the territory after we've expelled, the majority of them, if you would come in and help rebuild, that would be really nice. Also, we'd like you to take in some refugees as well. And it's not a good deal. The Americans they're locked into this. A big part of these normalization deals is, of course, to squeeze China out of the region. All these policies only, improve China's stature in the world, if by nothing else than just comparison to the United States. I mean, the Chinese are investing hundreds of billions of dollars into the region, have good relationships with virtually, each side, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Israelis, and the Americans are there when the Chinese broker a peace deal between the Iranians and the Saudis, and instead they're the ones backing a genocide and the Israelis against Palestinians, and potentially going to be backing a much larger war against Iran that could kill millions of people. And so they need to have some self-awareness here and push for peace with Yemen, and that could actually open the door to a more stable situation in the region more broadly. But it's going to have to start with using our leverage with Israel.
Connor, this is one of those policies, this war in Yemen, where it's so stupid, and this idea of we're going to somehow end the war in Yemen, Lebanon, Gaza, with the Arab states rebuilding Gaza. It just seems like the White House would have to know that this is a fiction, and maybe this really is just a ploy to let Israel and give Israel an excuse to keep up the killing, because it's just, there's little other way to explain it. The stupidity thing just almost doesn't seem to cut it anymore. But we should wrap it up here. Everybody be sure to subscribe. We got some great guests coming up this week. A couple of people that haven't been on the show for some time, and we will see you later.